The desert heat in Arizona didn't just press down, it crushed. By noon, the training grounds shimmered under the blaze, the air rippling above the cracked red earth like it was breathing. The metallic tang of sweat and gun oil hung heavy, mixing with the acrid sting of dust kicked up by boots and the hiss of wind cutting low across the range. 256 recruits stood in uneven lines, uniforms plastered to their backs, faces set in a mix of exhaustion and quiet dread. They had just failed the Devil's Gauntlet again. The obstacle course wasn't a test so much as a dare from hell itself. A gauntlet of ropes, mud pits, and a 12-foot wall that had swallowed stronger men whole. Now, their breaths came sharp, their eyes darted sideways, and more than a few smirks curled at the corners of dry lips, ready to find an easier target for their frustration. That's when the squeak of rubber wheels and the faint clink of cleaning supplies broke the tense quiet. A gray custodial cart rolled into view, pushed by a young woman in a faded jumpsuit that had once been slate blue, the words, "Custodial Services" barely visible across the back. Hoa Karen. She was 24, maybe younger to some eyes, her skin catching the sun in a warm bronze, her dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail. There was nothing loud about her presence, no swagger, no wasted movement. She kept her head slightly lowered, eyes scanning for stray debris, the broom handle resting in one hand like it was an extension of her arm. Most days, she was invisible. And when she wasn't invisible, she was an easy punchline. Today, though, the air shifted the second she crossed into the recruit's periphery. It started small Jimmy Snake, a wiry recruit with a grin that never meant anything good, elbowed Brad, the blonde 6-footer who liked to fill silence with the sound of his own voice. "Hey, housekeeping's here," Jimmy muttered, loud enough to carry. Brad smirked, the sun glinting off his sweat-slick hair. "Hey, sweetheart, the mud pit's filthy, want to give it a scrub?" His buddies chuckled, low and sharp. A crushed water bottle sailed lazily through the air and clanged against the metal edge of her cart. Karen didn't flinch. She bent down, picked it up, and dropped it into the trash bag. Her movement slow enough to make it clear she wasn't rushing for anyone. From the far side of the course, a voice cut across the heat. "What's going on over there?" It was Lieutenant Miles, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the entire scene back at them. He had the kind of voice that liked an audience, and the recruit straightened automatically, eager to see where this might go. His eyes landed on Karen, lingering like he was flipping through the mental file he didn't actually have on her. "Custodian, huh?" he said, walking closer. "You ever think about giving the gauntlet a shot?" The way he said it was half challenge, half theater, a bone tossed to the pack. Snickers rippled through the ranks, and someone in the back called, "Blindfold her for fun." The laughter broke wide open, harsh in the hot air. Karen straightened, her gaze lifting to meet Miles's through the glare. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes dark. Steady held something that didn't quite match the uniform she wore. She didn't answer right away, letting the noise stretch until it started to feel thin. The recruit shifted, sensing the moment but not yet understanding it. Then, with a voice so even it made the laughter hiccup in mid-breath, she said, "I've done it before." No smile, no wink, just the flat truth, dropped like a stone into still water. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rattle of her cart in the wind. And though no one could have said why, a few of them, just a few, found themselves standing a little straighter, as if some part of them had been called out without a single insult spoken. Jimmy's grin widened like a knife sliding free of its sheath, the kind of grin that promised trouble for someone else. He took a lazy step forward, letting his shadow stretch across the dirt toward Hoa Karen. "Oh, you've done it before?" he said, pitching his voice loud enough for the whole formation to hear. "Was it on a kiddie playground? Maybe at a carnival?" His words drew a chorus of chuckles from the cluster of recruits behind him, their laughter sharp in the dry air. Brad followed right on his heels, that practiced smirk curling as if he'd been waiting for this moment all morning. "Tell you what," he said, tilting his head toward the Devil's Gauntlet, "you get through that wall over there, blindfolded, and I'll shine your cart for a week. Sound fair?" The others roared with laughter, some slapping each other on the shoulders like they just witnessed the height of wit. Torres, the former college linebacker with a build like a battering ram, stepped in close, his breath heavy with the smell of energy drinks and heat. He reached for the cart, flicking the corner of the trash bag with one thick finger. Better start emptying this first, he said, eyes narrowing. Less wait for when you drag it crying off the course. Karen didn't step back, didn't give him the satisfaction. She simply pushed the cart's handle forward until it bumped his shin, just hard enough to make him move. The crowd erupted with a fresh burst of ooze, as if sensing a spark that might catch flame. And then Haley appeared, sliding into the space like she owned it. She had a neat French braid, nails painted a glossy red that caught the sunlight, and a smile too polished to be anything but dangerous. "Sweetheart," she said, voice dripping with false warmth, "you're embarrassing yourself. This isn't some fun run. This is where we separate the real soldiers from the daydreamers." Her eyes flicked over Karen's uniform, from the dust-stained knees to the faded patch on her chest. "And I think you know exactly which one you are." The words hung there, smug and glinting. Karen's hands tightened slightly on the cart's handle, her knuckles whitening for half a second before she released the tension. She looked straight at Haley, her expression steady, unreadable. "I'm not here to play games," she said quietly, but the evenness of her tone cut through the laughter like a scalpel. For a moment, Haley's smile faltered, but she recovered with a toss of her braid and a glance toward Lieutenant Miles, who had stopped a few paces away, watching with his head cocked. Miles let the pause stretch, feeding the tension like a showman. "You know what?" he said finally, glancing from Karen to the recruits. "Let's make it official. Karen here wants to run the gauntlet, right?" He didn't wait for her answer before turning to the crowd. "What do you say, folks? Blindfold challenge?" The chant started low, "Do it, do it," but gathered volume quickly, the heat and dust swirling around the sound until it felt like the whole training ground was thundering with it. Karen glanced toward the course, then back at Miles, meeting his eyes without blinking. It was only a few seconds, but it was enough to make him shift his stance, the faintest hitch in his easy confidence. "You'll need a uniform," he said, pointing toward a heap of spares near the bleachers. One of the recruits, a guy named Cole, snatched up an oversized set and tossed it to her. "Here," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Try not to trip on it before you start." As she slipped the loose green fabric over her jumpsuit, Brad and Torres made a game of tugging at the drawstrings, loosening them so the pants pooled around her ankles and the sleeves hung past her wrists. "Look at this," Brad laughed, turning to the others. "She'll go down before she makes the first turn." Torres chuckled, stepping aside with mock gallantry. When Karen knelt to retie the drawstrings, Torres leaned in, his voice low enough for only a few nearby to hear. "This course isn't for charity cases," he said, dropping a crumpled soda can so it landed by her knee. "Better start with what you're good at cleaning up after the rest of us." His buddies snickered, waiting for her to snap back. But Karen just picked up the can, dropped it into the bag, and said, "Time's only wasted if you're not learning." The words landed heavier than the can itself, and Torres straightened, his smirk fading just a fraction. The chant from the crowd swelled again, and somewhere beyond the line of recruits, the Devil's Gauntlet loomed waiting. The chant was still pounding in the air when Hoa Karen stood, brushing the dust from her knees with a slow, deliberate motion. She tugged the oversized sleeves up her forearms, retied the drawstrings at her waist with quick, sure fingers, and then looked out at the mass of recruits. The sunlight caught in her eyes, not bright enough to make them sparkle, but enough to draw every gaze. Something about that stillness cut through the jeers, the way a sudden drop in wind makes you realize a storm's coming. She didn't posture, didn't grin, didn't so much as raise her voice. "Fine," she said, each syllable steady, like she was stating a fact instead of accepting a dare. "I'll run it." For a heartbeat, the whole scene seemed to tilt. The recruits whooped and hollered, high-fiving like they just trapped their prey. Jimmy Snake let out a sharp laugh, already picturing her collapse halfway through. "This is going to be good," he crowed, slapping Brad on the shoulder. Brad's grin stretched wider, but his eyes flicked briefly to the course, as if part of him wanted to be sure it was as impossible as he remembered. Near the edge of the bleachers, Jack, the base's maintenance tech, leaned on his mop handle, watching her with a faint, almost secretive smile. He'd seen her around, moving through the base like she belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. He didn't join the chant, didn't shout encouragement or mockery. He just watched, eyes narrowing like he was looking for something he already suspected he'd find. Karen's walk toward the starting line wasn't hurried, but it wasn't slow either. The sound of her janitor's shoes scuffing the dirt seemed to pull at the edges of the crowd's noise. She stepped into the space between the first obstacle and the onlookers, the course looming ahead like a beast stretching in the sun. The Devil's Gauntlet was built to break you before you even touched it. Steel poles gleaming in the heat, rope nets sagging with mud, the 12-foot wall standing like the Last Judgment. Lieutenant Miles followed her in, clipboard still tucked under his arm, but his earlier swagger was a little tighter now. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his tone pitched halfway between teasing and testing. Karen didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the first obstacle. "You'll see," she said, voice low but certain. It wasn't a boast, it was a statement, the kind you made when you already knew the ending. From somewhere off to the side, Haley called out, "Try not to break a nail, honey." The laugh she added was too sharp, like she needed it to carry farther than it naturally would. A few recruits echoed her, but their chuckles felt thinner than before, like they were trying to convince themselves they still had the upper hand. Miles gave a quick nod to Dalton, the grizzled master sergeant who ran the course. Dalton raised one bushy eyebrow at Karen, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. "All right then," he said, his voice gravel over steel. "When you're ready, we'll see what you've got." Karen rolled her shoulders once, the loose uniform shifting over her frame. She adjusted the waistband, tightened the knot, and then turned her head slightly toward the recruits. Her expression didn't change, but the way her eyes moved across them felt like a quiet inventory, seeing each face, marking each smirk, every doubtful glance. And for reasons they wouldn't be able to name later, a few of them felt a prickle of unease crawl up the back of their necks. Jack's smile deepened just enough to crease the weathered skin around his eyes. Under his breath, too low for anyone else to catch, he murmured, "She remembers." The crowd pressed in closer, the heat from bodies mingling with the desert air. Even the ones who thought they knew exactly how this would go found themselves leaning forward, just a little, as Karen stepped into position at the line. Somewhere inside the noise, the energy had shifted. No one could point to the exact moment, but the balance between mockery and curiosity had begun to tip. The Devil's Gauntlet waited, and so did she. The whistle hadn't blown yet, but the crowd's energy pulsed like it was already in motion. Hoa Karen stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the dirt until it touched the base of the first obstacle, a 3-meter steel pole, slick from the dew that had burned off slower in the early morning shade. It was the kind of obstacle that chewed up confidence. Even fresh recruits in peak conditions slipped halfway up, their boots squealing against metal before gravity claimed them. The pole stood there in the midday glare, daring her to try. She reached for it without hesitation, one hand curling around the cool steel, the other finding a groove so small most wouldn't have felt it. Her movements were economical, no wasted motion, no sudden lunges. In 2 fluid pulls, she was halfway up. A third pull, a shift of her hips, and she was standing on the narrow top, rung like it was solid ground. No pause, no wobble. She swung her legs over the far side, dropped down, and landed so lightly that the dust barely stirred around her boots. The crowd's reaction was split. A few whistles and sarcastic claps from Jimmy and Brad, loud enough to mask the silence from others. Ethan, the quiet recruit near the back, didn't join in. He just watched with narrowed eyes, his hand tightening on the notebook he always carried. Dalton, arms crossed, let the faintest flicker of interest touch his face before it was gone again. Karen didn't look at them. She adjusted the oversized sleeves, tugging them back up to her elbows, then started toward the next section. That's when Jack's voice, calm and low, floated in from the sideline. "Don't blink, boys," he said, his mop leaning against the fence. "You might miss it." Jimmy twisted toward him, frowning. "Miss what?" "She got lucky. Pole's the easy part." Jack didn't answer. He just smirked and turned his attention back to Karen, who was already halfway up the rope net, her hands and feet finding holds with the precision of someone moving through a map they'd memorized years ago. Halfway up, the wind shifted, carrying the tang of sun-baked rope and the faint creak of the steel anchors. For anyone else, it might have been a distraction. For her, it was a signal. She moved faster, cresting the top in one smooth roll that had her back on her feet before most realized she'd cleared it. The recruits nearest the rope stared, blinking like they'd missed a frame of film. When she touched down on the far side, Torres barked out, "All right, so she can climb." "Big deal." His tone was forced, a little too sharp. He glanced at Brad, as if seeking reinforcement, but Brad didn't look back. He was watching Karen's posture as she walked, the way her head tilted just slightly, listening for something they couldn't hear. At the second water station, Haley was waiting, one hand on her hip, the other holding a plastic bottle she didn't offer. "Careful," she said sweetly as Karen passed. "It gets harder from here." Karen didn't break stride. "Good," she replied, not even looking her way. It was subtle, but the ripple that went through the crowd after that was real. Some of the smirks softened into something else, attention, maybe even the edge of respect. Others doubled down, shouting predictions of how far she'd make it before collapsing. But under all of it, there was that same small shift that had started at the starting line, growing just enough for everyone to feel, without knowing why. Dalton's eyes narrowed as he tracked her to the next obstacle. The Devil's Gauntlet had a way of stripping people down to their real selves, and right now it was showing him something he didn't expect. Dalton's voice cut through the thick heat like the crack of a rifle. "All right, Karen," he called, his tone flat but carrying that edge that could slice you open if you weren't careful. "You think you've got this? Let's see you run it blind." The reaction was instant cheers, whistles, and a chorus of "Do it" that rolled across the training ground. The words seemed to take on a life of their own, bouncing off the steel structures and folding back into the crowd's roar. Brad let out a sharp laugh, pulling a black blindfold from his back pocket like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Special delivery," he said, stepping forward to offer it with a mock bow. His smirk was all teeth. Karen took the blindfold without a word. Her fingers tested the fabric for a brief moment, the gesture so subtle it could have been missed. Then she began tying it behind her head with a calm precision that made the noise around her feel almost distant. The oversized sleeves of the borrowed uniform shifted with the breeze, flapping like they were trying to pull her back. Ethan moved closer from the back of the formation, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do this," he said, his gaze fixed on her like he was trying to anchor her to the ground. For the first time since she'd stepped up to the line, Karen's expression softened, just for a flicker. "I know," she said quietly, then pulled the knot tight at the back of her head. The blindfold sank the world into darkness. But her posture didn't change. She stood still, head tilted slightly, breathing even, as though she were listening to something only she could hear: the creak of a rope in the wind, the faint hiss of sand shifting under someone's boot, the distant metallic clink from the far side of the course. Dalton lifted his whistle to his lips. The sharp blast split the air, and she moved. Her first steps were precise, the soles of her janitor's shoes finding the narrow beam of the balance log without so much as a scrape. She shifted her weight, pivoted, and vaulted to the next platform in one fluid motion. The crowd's cheers faltered into a strange, uncertain murmur. She slipped under the cargo net, low and fast, her elbows and knees driving her forward like she'd rehearsed this exact movement 1,000 times. At the mud pit, she didn't hesitate, hands to rope, feet driving off the edge. She swung across in a perfect arc, releasing at just the right moment to land square on solid ground. A cloud of dust rose, hung in the air, then drifted away behind her. By the time she reached the tunnel crawl, the energy in the crowd had shifted again. The laughter was gone, replaced by a restless quiet broken only by the occasional barked exclamation, "No way! She can't see a thing! How the hell?" And then came the wall. 12 feet of sheer vertical wood, sun-baked and waiting to send her back down like it had done to dozens of recruits that morning. Karen's steps slowed as she approached, not in hesitation but in calculation. She ran the last few paces, jumped, and her hands caught the lip with perfect accuracy. Her body swung upward in a single, controlled motion, boots clearing the edge before she pulled herself over and dropped lightly on the far side. The stopwatch in Dalton's hand beeped. 87 seconds. The record had been 3 minutes, 14 seconds. Karen reached up and pulled the blindfold loose, letting it dangle around her neck. Her breathing was steady, her face as calm as if she'd just taken a walk to the mess hall. The recruits stood frozen, some with their phones still raised but forgotten in their grip. Miles's mouth hung slightly open. Even Brad's smirk had collapsed into something blank. She didn't look at any of them. Instead, she turned, started walking back toward her cart, and the crowd parted without a single word. Jimmy Snake was the first to snap out of the stunned silence, his voice cutting through the heat like a pebble tossed into still water. "She had help," he barked, pointing toward the far side of the course. "Somebody must have guided her. No one moves like that blind." The accusation spread like a ripple, a few heads nodding, desperate to find a foothold for their disbelief. Brad seized on it, his voice pitching higher than usual. "Check her shoes," he said, stepping forward with that false confidence of someone who needed to be right. "Bet she's got sensors or something in there." Karen stopped mid-stride, turned just enough to face them, and with a motion that was almost lazy, began untying her laces. The crowd hushed. She kicked the first shoe off, then the second, letting them fall in the dirt at her feet. "Go ahead," she said, her tone so steady it made Jimmy flinch. Dalton stepped forward, picking one up and turning it over. Worn rubber soles, frayed stitching, a faint outline of dust where her foot had pressed for years. No devices, no tricks. Just shoes that had seen more miles than most of them could imagine. Brad's smirk faltered. Jimmy looked away, muttering something under his breath that even he didn't seem to believe. From the shaded edge of the bleachers, a figure stepped into the sunlight. Tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair that glinted under the sun, Colonel Harrison. The murmurs started instantly, rippling through the crowd. He rarely left his office during drills, and when he did, it was never for something as trivial as a dare. His gaze swept the recruits before settling on Karen. "You know who holds the blindfold record for the Gauntlet?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who never needed to raise it twice. No one answered. "Specialist Hoa Karen. Ranger Regiment, 2nd Battalion. 6 years ago." The air shifted. A couple of recruits straightened without realizing it, like their bodies knew to react before their minds caught up. Ethan's grip tightened on his notebook. Even Dalton's eyebrows twitched upward, though he said nothing. "She ran this course in 89 seconds blindfolded," Harrison continued, "and held that record until today, because she just broke her own time." He paused, letting that sink in. "She's also a combat veteran, 3 tours, decorations for valor that none of you have earned the right to ask about." The heat seemed to press heavier, though the air had gone still. Haley's arms slowly dropped from where they'd been crossed. Brad stared at the ground. Jimmy found sudden interest in the toe of his boot. Karen didn't bask in it. She simply bent down, slid her shoes back on, and tied the laces in 2 quick knots. "I mop floors now," she said quietly, almost to herself, "but I never forgot the course." Then she turned and pushed her cart toward the supply shed, the wheels rattling softly over the packed dirt. The recruits didn't move out of her way because they were told to. They moved because something in her presence made standing in her path feel wrong. As she passed, Jack gave her the smallest of nods, one soldier to another, though he'd never worn her uniform. When she reached the shade, Harrison's voice called after her. "Specialist." She stopped, half-turned. He didn't smile, but his tone shifted. Warmer. "Good to see you back on the field." Karen held his gaze for a heartbeat, then nodded once. "Good to be back," she said, though whether she meant the course or something else entirely, no one could tell. Then she pushed the cart onward, disappearing into the shimmering heat, leaving behind a training ground that didn't feel quite the same as it had an hour ago. By the next morning, the air on the training ground felt different, quieter, tighter, as if the desert itself had taken a breath and was holding it. The recruits lined up earlier than usual, boots squared, eyes front. No one whistled when Hoa Karen pushed her cart past them, the sun flashing off the metal rim of the mop bucket. The same men who'd shouted at her yesterday now tracked her with sideways glances, their mouths closed, their hands still. Jimmy Snake lasted until lunch before his temper cracked. He was called into the admin office and came out pale, his usual swagger stripped down to stiff, hurried steps. Word moved fast, disciplinary reassignment, too many complaints about his mouth. Yesterday being the final straw. By sundown, he was packing for a post in Alaska, the kind of place where even the wind stopped talking to you. Brad's fall was slower but sharper. Someone no one admitted to who had uploaded the full clip of him taunting Karen before the run. It spread through the base like fire in dry grass, then leaked into the local community page, then onto a military forum with 100,000 members. By the end of the week, the gym brand that had plastered his face on their posters quietly cut ties. The posters came down overnight. His name stopped appearing on the roster for base athletics. Haley tried to pretend nothing had changed, walking the mess hall with that same calculated sway, but her name vanished from the promotion shortlist posted outside the personnel office. No explanation was written. None was needed. The list said more in ink than any officer could with words. Torres kept his mouth shut, but his silence carried its own confession. The next time Karen crossed his path, he stepped aside without being told. He didn't meet her eyes, but his jaw was tight, as if he was grinding down a piece of pride too sharp to swallow. And then there was the paper. Mid-morning, it appeared on the bulletin board outside the mess hall, one sheet of white with neat black block letters. Never underestimate the one holding the mop. They might have once held the line for you. Asterisk. No name at the bottom. No logo. Nothing to tell who put it there. Recruits stopped to read it. Some twice. Ethan stood in front of it for a long time, his notebook in hand, like he was memorizing each word. Dalton didn't mention the run during drills, but his eyes followed Karen whenever she passed the edge of the course. Harrison said nothing either, though the way the colonel's gaze lingered on her at morning muster was enough to make the others notice. Respect was a language here, and it was spoken in silences, not speeches. Karen herself didn't change her routine. She still rolled the cart through the barracks, still mopped the same corners, still paused to empty the same bins. But now the recruits shifted out of her way without being asked. Conversations dropped when she was near, not from fear, but because no one wanted their words to sound small next to the weight of what they'd seen. Brad tried once, days later, to catch her alone by the supply shed. "Look," he started, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know." "You didn't care," she cut in, not harsh, just flat. She closed the shed door behind her, locked it, and stepped past him. Knowing doesn't change the choice you make in the moment. She kept walking. He didn't follow. By the end of the week, the Gauntlet had a new nickname. Karen's Run. Half joking, half not. It slipped into conversation whenever someone complained about the course. No one challenged the name, and no one, no matter how fit or cocky, came close to touching her time. The record hung over the training ground like a shadow that wasn't going anywhere. It was late afternoon when the first hint surfaced so small it would have passed unnoticed if anyone but Ethan had been watching. Hoa Karen was pushing her cart past the armory when the metallic clatter of rifles being racked echoed from inside. She slowed, just for a breath, her hand tightening on the cart's handle. Her eyes flicked toward the open doorway, the shadows inside cutting across the polished steel of the gun racks. The look wasn't fear. It was recognition, quick, sharp, and gone before anyone else could read it. She kept moving, wheels rattling over the cracked pavement. But Ethan had seen. He made a note in his ever-present book, his pencil scratching fast. That night, Jack was mopping the corridor outside the motor pool when she passed again, her steps lighter than usual. The overhead lights hummed, and from inside one of the garages came the muted sound of tools on metal. Parked at the edge of the shadows was a sand-dusted Humvee, its hood up. Karen's gaze lingered on it, her eyes tracing the stenciled numbers on the side panel. Jack caught it from the corner of his eye and said, without looking up, "That one's been here since Kandahar." She didn't answer, but the smallest crease formed between her brows. Then she walked on. 2 days later, the black SUV rolled in. It was late morning, sun glaring off the windshield as it swung into the lot beside the supply shed. The engine cut, and a man stepped out tall, built solid, with the kind of posture that didn't fade when you left the service. Civilian clothes, but the boots gave him away. He scanned the yard once before spotting her stacking mops inside the shed. His presence bent the air. Dalton stopped mid-sentence at the far end of the yard, and even Harrison's head turned from the bleachers. Karen glanced up, and something flickered in her eyes, warmer than recognition, sharper than surprise. She set the mop aside, wiped her hands on her jumpsuit, and met him in the doorway. No one heard what he said, but whatever it was, she smiled, not the polite, guarded smile she wore around the recruits, but something smaller, more real. He tilted his head toward the SUV, and she followed without looking back. The doors closed, the engine hummed, and they were gone in a trail of dust that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. The rumors started before the SUV reached the gate. Brad muttered something about a handler. Haley, leaning in too close to Torres, whispered, Husband? Commander? Jimmy, packing his things in bitter silence for his reassignment, snorted, "Whoever he is, he's not here to see any of you." That evening, Ethan stayed late on the bleachers, flipping back through his notes. A pattern was forming small pauses, certain objects that made her eyes narrow, the way she moved when the wind carried the smell of gun oil. She wasn't just muscle memory and old metals. There was something else, coiled tight beneath the surface. Jack, emptying a bucket nearby, caught Ethan watching her from across the yard. "Don't go digging if you don't want to find what's buried," he said, his tone casual but his eyes fixed on the mop water swirling down the drain. Ethan didn't answer. He just kept writing. Somewhere in the barracks, the bulletin board note still clung to its tack, curling at the corners in the dry heat. Recruits stopped to read it every day, some lingering longer than others, but now, when they glanced toward Karen, there was a new layer in their stares, not just respect, but curiosity sharpened into something restless. Whatever she had been, whatever she still was, it wasn't finished. And on a base where secrets usually sank fast, hers seemed to be rising. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the base shifted in ways no drill sergeant could have ordered. The Devil's Gauntlet still loomed over the training ground, but now its shadow carried her name. Karen's run had become shorthand for impossible feats, half challenge, half warning. Recruits who once mocked the mop bucket now spoke in quieter tones when she passed, their eyes following her not with derision, but with a wary kind of respect. Karen never sought to cash in on it. She kept her same route. Barracks at dawn, mess hall by mid-morning, supply shed in the heat of the afternoon. The cart still rattled over the same cracks in the pavement, the mop still swished in the same corners. Yet every action carried a new gravity, as if the weight of that day's run had sunk into the ground and followed her footsteps. Ethan was the first to approach her after the buzz had dulled but not died. She was coiling a hose outside the mess hall when he stopped a few feet away, his notebook in hand. "I want to be that good someday," he said. No bravado, just quiet certainty. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Then don't talk about it. Do it." It wasn't advice so much as a law. He nodded, closing the notebook as if sealing a contract. The bulletin board note never came down. The corners yellowed, the ink faded, but it stayed pinned where everyone could see. New recruits stopped in front of it their first week, hearing fragments of the story from those who'd been there. Some took it as inspiration, others as a cautionary tale. Either way, it stuck. One afternoon, Dalton watched her mop the edge of the gauntlet while the day's recruits struggled through the course. He caught himself timing them without meaning to, the stopwatch cold in his palm. Not one even came close. When she glanced his way, he nodded once. She returned it, nothing more. But it felt like the kind of exchange you didn't put words to. Brad kept his head down now, working harder in drills, saying little outside of them. Haley stopped throwing out her sugar-coated barbs. She'd shifted to watching from the sidelines, arms crossed, as if trying to solve a puzzle she'd been wrong about. Torres gave curt nods when their paths crossed. And though Jimmy was long gone to the frozen edge of nowhere, his name still floated around in stories that ended with someone saying, "Yeah," and then she shut him down. Sometimes, late in the day, Karen would walk past the gauntlet when it was empty, the sun sinking low enough to paint the poles and walls in blood-orange light. She never stopped, never ran it again. But her eyes would linger, tracing the course from start to finish, as if she could still feel every rope in her hands, every plank under her boots. Then she'd keep walking, her cartwheels humming over the dirt. Jack noticed it. So did Ethan. Even Harrison, passing by once on his way to the motor pool, slowed to watch her move until she disappeared around the corner. In the end, her legacy wasn't in the record time, though no one came close to breaking it. It was in the way the base learned to measure people differently. In the silences that replaced the jeers. In the awareness that you could never really know the weight someone carried or what they'd done to bear it just by looking at the clothes they wore or the job they held. Karen never told the full story of her service, never recounted the missions or the medals. She didn't need to. The truth was etched into that day on the gauntlet, in the way a crowd went from laughter to stillness, in the way a blindfold didn't slow her down. It lived in the gap between who they thought she was and who she proved herself to be. And for anyone paying attention, that gap was the lesson. She kept moving, and the base kept watching. The silence between them spoke louder than anything else could.